Welcome to Trib Talk. I'm Jennifer Napier-Pierce with the Salt Lake Tribune. Utah can afford to manage federal public lands, but the takeover could strain the budget. Those are among the conclusions of a group of economists tasked with looking at the economics of a public land transfer. It's an idea that has been circulating in the state for some time, and that report was presented to state lawmakers this week. Joining me with reaction to the 800-page report and its conclusions, Representative Ken Ivory. He's sponsor of the bill that calls for transfer of public lands to Utah. He's with us from his office at the state capitol. And Representative, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Jennifer, pleased to be with you.
Also with us here in the newsroom, Steve Block. He is the legal director for the advocacy group Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. And Steve, welcome to you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer.
And you can join us too if you've got questions or comments about this idea of transferring public lands to the state of Utah for management and the entire deeds to those lands. You can send your thoughts to the hashtag Trib Talk on Twitter and Google+. You can put your comments right here on the website, sltrib.com, or send us a text to the number on the screen, 801-609-8059. This is a massive report. We will get to your analysis in more detail as we go, but first your general reaction to the analysis, what you've read, what you've studied, what you heard at the committee meeting this morning. Representative Ivory, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, Jennifer, we've been hearing for as long as we've had this bill out from a number of groups that kind of want to perpetuate the fear that we can't manage our own lands, that somehow we couldn't afford to manage our own lands and take care of our own lands and resources. Well, just to read one of the summaries of the report, it said, most significantly, it demonstrates that a transfer of public lands can be an economically sound pathway to a more balanced public lands policy. The study demonstrates this can be accomplished without sacrificing the beauty of our state, the quality of our life, or the attraction of Utah to tourists and recreationists from around the country and the world. That's clearly what we've been working on all along, is getting to better access, better health, and better productivity, because clearly the status quo is not working. Access is being restricted, the health of the lands is diminishing, and productivity is depressed. So the study gives us a good pathway forward in terms of a tool to use as we pull together the mechanisms for balancing multiple use with sustained yield productivity and local planning.
The study conducted over the past year by several groups of economists at the University of Utah, Weber State University, and Utah State University. They say that it costs about $250 million to manage public lands here in the state. Revenue clocks in at about $330 million. So if you look at that math, it looks to cover the costs. It also notes that the state would lose federal dollars. Plus, it would have to figure out how to replace all the stuff that the feds do, like managing fire and monitoring endangered species and on and on and on. So, Representative, why should Utah do this?
Well, so just as a status quo, as you mentioned, there's nearly a $100 million net positive to the state without changing anything in the management practices, just taking over status quo what the federal government's doing already. Well, clearly in the report they also point out that fire management at the federal level is clearly focused just on suppressing wildfires, allowing the damage to get to catastrophic levels, and then spending more money to put out the fires. Well, there's substantial opportunities for more efficient management, for better access and better productivity. Why Utah should do it? Well, number one, the Supreme Court just last year said the constitutional equality of the states is essential to the harmonious operation of the republic, and that our nation was and is a union of states equal in power, dignity, and authority. We simply want the federal government to honor the very same statehood terms to Utah that they honored with all states east of Colorado, so that we can manage these lands for better access, better health, better productivity. And this study that was done by 3 universities in Utah, 18 months, $500,000 study, very exhaustive, scrupulously objective, shows that clearly there's a pathway forward. In fact, they show under many of the scenarios this could be more than $1 billion a year in net new revenue to help fund education without even looking at greater efficiency in management and greater productivity.
Pretty rosy picture there. Steve Block, let's bring you into the conversation. The report does say that things pencil out, that Utah could actually even make some money if it took over these management of federal lands. What's wrong with it?
Well, Jennifer, let's start off with where the representative left off, and that's this notion of funding our schools and the land grab, and that's exactly what it is. It's a land grab that this legislation proposes. Simply isn't sound policy, and it's not a serious way to handle the funding of our schools. If we want to be serious about how do we bring more money into Utah's schools, it's going to be doing things like severance taxes for coal. The state of Utah has no severance tax on coal, and that's unlike all of our surrounding states. So let's roll up our sleeves and deal with things that make sense, that are achievable, and that are legal, like imposing a severance tax on coal. Something else might be to slightly increase the severance tax that we charge on the production of oil and gas. Once again, we're the lowest in the Intermountain West in that area. And finally, something else might be to block up our school trust lands and think about a way to more effectively manage them. Now, that's something that SUA and a number of stakeholders are it's something that SUA and a number of stakeholders are doing in the Public Lands Initiative, along with Mr. Bishop and a number of other folks.
But why not actually take over these lands? I mean, are there economic reasons why you think it's a bad idea? You've talked about what maybe the state of Utah could focus on in a different way, but as far as a transfer of public lands, what's wrong with that? Steve Block.
Well, what I've focused on really is that things that are achievable and things that are real. And this land grab is simply not real. It's, you know, what the state's own lawyers and what a team of attorneys and scholars from the University of Utah have said is that there's very, very low chance the state of Utah would win a lawsuit. And that's what it's going to take. I mean, let's be clear, the United States is not simply going to hand over land that's owned by all Americans solely for the benefit of Utahns. So there's going to have to be a lawsuit, and we're likely to lose that lawsuit. So what I'm talking about are real ways to handle the things that Ken has talked about. But, you know, for the finances of this, as the Tribune noted this morning, the dollars and cents only work if we assume consistently high prices of oil and gas. And what we've seen most recently is that the price of oil wildly fluctuates. If you ask the Russians whose finances are going down the drain with the low prices of oil, if the market fluctuates, I think the answer is yes. And so why would we hitch our star for this state, a state that prides itself on sound financial management and fiscal restraint, to such a to these wild market forces? And that's the only way it makes sense. Of course, it could also make sense if we start to sell off or very heavily develop and privatize the lands that make up the natural heritage of Utahns and of all Americans.
Speaking with Steve Block from SUA, also with this Representative Ken Ivory, and we're talking about the economic report that came out this week, assessing whether Utah can take over federal lands within its borders. Can it afford to do so? The study says yes, with some conditions. We're asking how would it work and why should we do it? Why should we move forward? You can join our conversation by sending comments to the hashtag Trib Talk on Twitter and Google+, or putting them right here at sltrib.com. Here's a comment from Greg Hunter. Explain to us an exit strategy should the state get their wish for controlling federal land when the state runs out of money to service the land, i.e. fire, water deletion from oil drilling, etc. Very short-term, narrow thinking. I guess that goes to Steve's question, Representative, that you know, should the state have this as a priority because there's very little chance that it actually would happen, that this is a bit of a gamble on a pipe dream. Representative, what do you think?
It's nice that Steve Block is a Supreme Court of one and he can guarantee what the Supreme Court will do. We've been dealing with a number of legal analysts. In fact, the top constitutional scholars in the nation say that the federal government has no business controlling all that land. I agree with Steve on one thing. This is indeed a land grab. The federal government controls 1/3 of the real estate in the United States with no constitutional authority to do it. They have constitutional authority in Article 1, Section 8 to have certain land with the consent of the legislature. In Article 4, their duty is to dispose. And so they control more than 50% of the land in the western United States. And he made a point of why hitch our star to this estimate of the state controlling the lands. Well, that's a great question. To have our star hitched to the federal government, you remember what happened a year ago. They had their own budget squabbles because they haven't had a budget for 6 years. They're $18 trillion in debt, hundreds of trillions in unfunded obligations, and they shut down the national parks. They shut down the national monuments. It was the state of Utah that met on an emergency basis to fund the opening of the parks. We still haven't been paid back, by the way. So when you look at, he talked about being serious on education funding. Right now we have over 1 million acres of SITLA land that are landlocked because they're surrounded by federally controlled lands. We can't even get to the lands we already own. So you look at opening that up and being able to deal with the lands that we do have. And you see, I'm also encouraged to hear Steve talk about increasing severance taxes on coal. Well, you have to be able to access those resources to have any sort of severance tax. And those are clearly things that the researchers talked about today. Increasing royalties on oil and gas, severance taxes on coal for those developments. And then also they talked about the ability, the freedom, the ingenuity, and the certainty to diversify. We had James McCarthy, the Director of Environmental Humanities from the University of Utah, to our commission last month, and he talked about clearly you have to have a balanced strategy going forward. Anyone that says environmentalism means having no job, having no home, having no ability to produce food, it clearly doesn't understand environmentalism, that you have to have a balance of protecting our heritage places. Clearly that's provided for in the bill and the Utah Wilderness Act, but also to have both access, health, and productivity of the lands in a balance determined by those who are closest to the land, understand the soil, the climate, the uniqueness of the land, so that we celebrate the diversity of our western lands to have them managed at the local level. So yeah, clearly this provides a path forward, and legally we have that roadmap forward. We also are working to negotiate with our federal partner, and when they say this can't happen, Jennifer, it's happening right now in Canada. Canada has negotiated with their federal governing partner the transfer of land, water, and resources to the provinces and the territories right now, because what they said is where matters are handled by those closest to the matter, they get better decisions. That's happening in Canada right now. Perhaps we can take a page on liberty, property, and self-governance from our neighbor to the north and negotiate in good faith with our federal partner to honor the very same statehood terms with Utah that it kept with all states east of Colorado.
You've brought up a lot of points, and I want to sort of pick apart each of those if we can get to as many as we can. There is a comment from Skier Jim 7, and it dovetails with something that Steve Block brought up. If oil prices remain stable, as we've seen this past month, they are not. And the study does assume that revenue from oil and gas development stays healthy, it is stable. We are seeing this volatility right now in the global oil market. If the state takes over, and if the oil and gas market tanks, how is the state going to pay for those parks? I mean, what contingencies are out there? What does the report say? Representative, maybe you can illuminate that.
Yeah, so the ultimate downside risk is $100 million. The upside risk, without any management efficiency or additional production, is into the billions of dollars, right? So even with a downside risk of $100 million, you have ways to diversify. Now, they ran a number of scenarios, even with oil prices going down to $40 a barrel. And oil prices fluctuate. We know it's a finite resource. We know that there's always going to be increasing demand until we can transition to other power sources, which is clearly part of the effort we need to look at as well. But even with oil prices low, then you transition to other opportunities. One of the things the researchers brought up, we have gone from nearly 30 mills, operating timber mills in the state, to down to 3, and they're operating skeleton crews. We used to have a vibrant timber industry that then harvested out trees to keep a sustainable level of trees in the forest so that we didn't have catastrophic fire conditions that burn millions of animals, destroy watershed like we saw with the blue ribbon fisheries in Huntington Canyon right here in Utah destroy watershed and pollute the air. So we have opportunities. We have a number of opportunities with certainty and the ability to move forward, controlling our destiny as a state, to have better access, better health, and better productivity. Clearly, oil and gas is a resource that provides a lot of funding, all kinds of opportunities when you have other resources, renewable resources at our disposal. But right now, we're simply locked out of that because 67% of our land is controlled by a federal government that's not honoring to Utah the very same statehood terms it kept with all states east of Colorado. And in fact, states east of Colorado, Jennifer, like Illinois and Florida and Missouri, they were 90% federally controlled for decades. They were in the same situation. They banded together, battled, and compelled Congress to transfer their lands. This has already been done before.
Steve, you say that the state is known for its fiscal responsibility, its fiscal restraint, and you see this as something that does not fit that pattern. Can you talk a little bit more about the concerns that you have with school funding a little bit?
Well, so what I was raising, Jennifer, is that, and I think we heard about this a little bit from Ken, is that school funding is what is quite often talked about as one of the driving needs for this land grab. And the things that I talked about, these severance taxes, which it's certainly worth highlighting that the land grab legislation and the fiscal report contemplate raising severance taxes later on, once, in their view, or in their world, once Utah has taken over these lands, then's going to be the time to raise the severance tax. Raise the severance taxes now, and let's see what kind of funds can be generated now from taking those sorts of common sense steps. And so we've already debunked the notion that the amount of private land is tied to school funding. There's just not that kind of a correlation. And so it's not the notion that states that have a high percentage of private land per capita can fund their students. These are choices that the legislature makes, and one of the choices that we think it should be looking at is how do we use tools at our disposal, things that are not pie in the sky. I mean, I have to tell you, when I was hearing from Ken that that I'm a Supreme Court of one, I think his notions about the power of Congress and what the Constitution says about the Congress's authority through the property clause to manage federal land, his view is flat out antithetical to 250 years of history and the jurisprudence we've seen from the United States Supreme Court. And that's why I say that it's pie in the sky, and that if we want to be real about how to fund our schools, it should be things like severance tax. You know, he talked about how school trust lands are scattered. They are, and that's why, as I said before, we're working to help consolidate those, and those are efforts that SUA and School Trust Lands and Mr. Bishop and the counties are working on to find common sense solutions.
Go ahead, Representative. I know you're chomping at the bit.
Yeah, I'd like to continue this discussion with Steve on increasing the severance tax. The ability for an energy company to invest billions of dollars to produce energy takes certainty in the return. And so if Steve is willing to work with us so that we can provide the certainty so that they have access to the resource, the ability to then supply the resource and use it, then absolutely. Then you look at the severance taxes and the abilities to deal with the industry. But he seems to be following the old mantra: if it moves, tax it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. And you've got to have a viable industry before you can look at severance taxes and increasing them. So as we work with Steve on making sure that our coal industry is viable, then absolutely, let's look at those options. Now, he brought up the tired old argument of they'd sell off all the land. The report very directly addresses that. It doesn't contemplate selling a single acre. It doesn't contemplate development of the lands. This is carrying things over status quo. As they are now, federal public lands become state public lands for multiple use with local management, and it's economically viable even to do that. So when you look at real viable solutions, we have $2.5 billion per pupil shortfall to the average per pupil spending. You're not going to do that with soundbite solutions. That's a big hole. It's a big gap. It's going to take real big, bold solutions. And I'm pleased that Steve wants to look at making a viable coal industry in Utah so that as we have that viable industry, we can make sure that we have the appropriate severance tax to fund education. I'm really pleased to hear him say that.
Well, I mean, it's ironic, right, because the state of Utah has a vibrant oil and gas industry, and we have these low severance taxes, and we have a strong coal industry that has no severance tax. And what we're talking about here is an entire game changer, that that the oil and gas and coal industries have developed on federal land, and those industries crave certainty, and they know the ground rules here. And what Ken is talking about is just this radical change that would entirely upset the apple cart. And it's just, as I said before, I mean, we're arguing about the money, but I think we need to go back to this notion that this is simply not going to happen. This is so pie in the sky. So let's not focus on could we make it work if the price of oil and gas stayed high. And of course, that's the only way that, to Ken's point about that there's not going to be a sell-off of federal land, that's only, or the state land, that's only if those prices of oil and gas stay high, which we know they don't do. So let's get real.
That's entirely wrong. It doesn't contemplate selling land. Under my bill, under the Utah Wilderness Act, under the Commission on the Stewardship of Public Lands, federal public lands become state public lands for multiple use with local planning. And so, we talked about it before. This has already been done before, and this is how radical it is, Jennifer. We simply want the federal government to keep the same statehood terms with Utah that it kept with North and South Dakota and Nebraska and Oklahoma and Louisiana and Alabama, the exact same statehood terms for the transfer of the public lands. And back to his point about the property clause, let's look at what the property clause of the Constitution says. It says, Congress shall have the power to dispose of, not keep the land forever, to dispose of and make needful rules and regulations respecting the territory, and nothing in the Constitution shall prejudice any claims of the United States or of the particular states. And in the original constitutional debate, it said any claims to the Western territories. That's the exact same language, the exact same framework by which Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Florida at one point said they're the worst off of all the Western states because the federal government controlled 90% of their land. They battled together. They compelled Congress to do the exact same thing we're working on now. It's so radical, we simply want Congress to honor the same statehood terms with Utah.
Okay, I want to move on. Here's a text. What makes Representative Ivory think the state would manage lands any more efficiently than the feds? I just renewed my driver's license at the DMV. I can assure you Utah is quite capable of inefficient bureaucratic nonsense. And who would manage the lands under this scenario? If Utah took over, would it be the Department of Natural Resources? Would it require forming a new state agency and all the costs and expertise that's involved in doing that? Representative, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennifer. That's something that is on the plan of work for the Commission. We clearly have to develop the board and the governing organization for managing the land. We've already got SITLA manages. I mean, think about this. SITLA already manages 3.5 million acres of public land. They do it generating a positive net revenue for our schools. The BLM, however, loses $1 an acre. SITLA makes $33 an acre, managing 3.5 million acres of public land, and they have 1 million acres tied behind their back because they can't access it due to federal restrictions shutting down roads and access and landlocked school trust lands. So, yeah, the states already manage millions of acres of public land. You can look at other states. Forestry, for example, in the state of Washington. The state of Washington has a forestry department, and get this, Jennifer, they're only 1,283 times more effective at generating revenue per acre than the U.S. Forest Service. Montana's only 917 times more effective at generating revenue per acre than the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service is managing the land, unfortunately, not the people on the ground. They're very conscientious and want to do their job, but partially from groups like Steve's that file lawsuit after lawsuit and keep them from being able to manage the health of the lands. Their hands are tied. And so you've got federal land policy that manages the land for maximum combustion. You don't have access, you don't have health, and you don't have productivity. The states already manage land for access, health, and productivity.
Let's go to a text from Darren Bushman. He's actually a county commissioner in Piute County. He writes, SUA has made a history of suing the federal government for mismanagement, but in turn refuses to think that local control would be better. And I guess this goes to Representative Ivory's point. What's the harm in letting, who cares who manages this land? If it pencils out, it pencils out. Why should the feds have something that local governments do not have? And
that's a great point, Jennifer. Peter Drucker made.
Oh, excuse me, Representative. I wanted to hear from Steve Block on this one.
So let me have 2 points in response. One is, federal policies are to manage these lands and resources for a whole host of purposes: for the protection of water, for watersheds, for wildlife, for natural resources, as well as for the development of oil, gas, coal, etc. That's not the focus that the state's going to bring. It's just not. And it's fictitious to think that the state of Utah is going to be able to pay for this by anything less than focusing the management of these lands on extraction and development. School trust lands, the reason that they make so much money is because their sole function is to make money for school children, and so they focus on extractive industry and development. I think that's the most straightforward answer, is that the federal government, who's looking out for these lands and resources for all Americans, and sure, we do sue them, the same that the state of Utah sues the federal government about how lands are being managed. We're trying to bring some balance there to how these lands are managed on the ground, but the principles that they're supposed to be adhering to are multiple use, sustained yield. That's not the focus the state's going to bring. It's just not.
Jennifer, that's the language right in my bill. Multiple use, sustained yield with local planning. And interestingly, Steve's organization, SUA, the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, they sue the federal government repeatedly, and they put out press releases that say the federal government is mismanaging the land. We agree with them, unfortunately. The federal government should focus on the things that it needs to do. World peace. We have geopolitical conflict all over the world. They have an $18 trillion debt, deficits rampant, unfunded obligations. They need to focus on the things that they're supposed to be doing and quit trying to do better the things they shouldn't be doing at all, like trying to micromanage land management in unique climate, unique culture, unique settings. We need to celebrate the diversity of our western lands and let those who are on the land, that know the climate, know the geography, know the geology, manage those lands, because as Canada is showing right now, those that are on the land are more responsive and more responsible than an unelected bureaucracy. Jennifer, they just had a sweeping change in Congress. I don't want Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, or Marco Rubio managing Utah lands. Bless their hearts, they may be nice folks, but they don't know Utah lands. They don't know our climate. They don't know the conditions on the ground as they change and the ability to deal with them. And so I don't want them managing our lands either.
Okay, let's go back to this point that these lands are lands that are federally owned and managed on behalf of all Americans. They're not lands that are owned by Utahns. And this is just a fiction that we continue to hear from Ken and from the supporters of the land grab, that these are Utah's lands that we need to take back. They're not lands that are owned by Utahns. These are lands owned by all Americans, and this land grab would essentially take away the heritage of all these Americans for the sole benefit of Utahns, and that's not right, and that's not going to happen.
Okay, we've only got about a minute left, and so I want to just get something that someone said in the committee hearing this morning. This is not the end. This is only the beginning of the discussion. Representative, where does this discussion go from here? Where should it go?
So you'll see on the plan of work that we adopted today that we have a lot of things to move forward, specifically to ensure multiple use, sustain yield with local planning, engaging our counties in the plans to preserve status quo, the valid existing rights, hunting, fishing, access, recreation, grazing, those sorts of things. We've got a lot of work to go forward in terms of working with our federal partners on legislation at the federal level. There's a great deal of work to do, and so we start moving forward methodically, like we did with the study, and simply move forward. Again, it's already been done before, and to be clear with the point of these lands belong to all of us, well, so did the lands in Illinois and Missouri and Florida, because as the Supreme Court said repeatedly, in these lands, in the federal public lands, they only own them as a trustee for temporary purposes to secure the rights of the states at statehood. It was the same deal with Oklahoma and the same deal with Illinois. And so to Steve's argument, I guess they either need to transfer the lands to Utah, or Illinois needs to give theirs back, and Florida needs to give theirs back, because the statehood terms are the same, the Constitution is the same. Those were federal lands owned by the United States in trust for temporary purposes to create new states.
And Steve, it doesn't sound like Representative Ivory or his colleagues are willing to abandon ship. They don't see this as a pipe dream, as you do. How could you persuade them otherwise?
Well, I don't think we're going to. I mean, that seems very clear. We've been at this for some time with Ken and with the folks on the Hill, and it's unfortunate. I think the taxpayer here is going to be the loser. We're going to be the loser in the short term because it takes state time and money to work up these schemes that are never going to be implemented, and will surely be the losers in the long term if lightning strikes and the state of Utah is able to take these lands away from all Americans, and then we're all going to be on the hook financially. And of course, as I said before, we are looking for real solutions to real problems here in Utah, and it's time for us all to roll up our sleeves and work together to try and find solutions that make sense and that are achievable.
I wish we could go longer, but our time is up. We will continue this discussion, and I appreciate both of your time today, Steve Block and Representative Ken Ivory. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jennifer.
And more on public lands issues right here at sltrib.com, something we'll continue to cover. Thanks so much for tuning into Trib Talk. We'll see you next time.